Also, Joe, thank you so much for your interest
Yeah,
in the music and thank you for this opportunity.
yeah, absolutely. No, it's wonderful to meet you. I'm looking forward to getting into the album. I've already played it on the show. I love it, so
Awesome.
thank you.
Thank you.
You bet. So let's begin our journey before we get into the music by asking you this. 5 years ago, this pandemic
Mhm.
was raging. So many things were happening. How did you make it through the pandemic of 2020, and how has it influenced your creativity and what you do now in 2025?
Sure. So during the pandemic, uh, I was stuck actually for the first 4 months or so here with my daughter. My wife and my father-in-law was really sick with cancer, and so my wife visited Turkey, and then the pandemic, broke out, and she got stuck there. So it was me and my daughter, which was a very interesting time because at the time my daughter was only 13 years old, and so we the creativity first started out with actually doing home productions in the studio you see behind me.
Yeah.
And my daughter would help me out. She was my number one assistant. But what I got out of the pandemic was mainly two things, or three things. Of course, I took the opportunity to write some music, but more importantly, I actually improved my video chops. Up until then, I had some, technology capabilities. I mean, I've always been tech savvy, but I mean, to use a camera properly, to light a scene and everything, that takes a different level of craft.
Yeah.
And and when I did my undergrad at Berklee College of Music back in the 90s, I actually did jazz composition and film scoring. So I always had some, affinity with film, but again, to use this kind of a lens versus that kind of a lens, and to gather all the equipment and so on and so forth was a different kind of process. So I took that time to really get my video and filming chops ready, and improved. And so luckily, through Amazon, I could order, light units, different types of lenses. I already had one camera. A couple months into that, I purchased another one. And so that was a very major improvement and creative side that I developed during the pandemic. The other thing is, going into the pandemic, Dave Liebman had asked me to write an album-long extended jazz orchestra piece. And we had actually premiered it and even recorded that piece with a full jazz, actually an expanded jazz orchestra prior to the pandemic. But we were just getting ready to wrap up post-production, and we were getting ready to release that album. And then the pandemic happened. And so we still ended up being able to complete the post-production, and we came out, and then I think it was July, so well into the pandemic is when we ended up releasing it. So that was the video side of things was great. I learned a lot. I improved that album with Liebman, which is one of my career highlights. I mean, can you imagine a living legend, jazz icon coming to you and asking you to write I mean, he basically practically commissioned me because we wrote all kinds of grant applications together to fund that whole undertaking. I mean, it really is the crown jewel of my life. And so that was the downside of the pandemic for me because the resulting album entitled The Rise Up, we just weren't able to promote it that well. We ended up playing a release show like a year and a half later. It just, so the upside, video and some new music, right? Composition, downside, a major highlight of my career kind of getting buried.
So let me ask you this: with Seven Shades of Melancholia, what was kind of the artistic vision for this project?
Sure. So I had a couple of different things kind of developing over the past, I'd say maybe 7 or so years. One of them is the instrument that I conceived and basically got the patent for, which is a digital microtonal keyboard, which I named the Renaissance 17. That has been a dream of mine for, believe it or not, for about 25 years. Because I'm originally from Turkey, I did not necessarily, by the way, grow up with Turkish classical or Turkish folk music. I actually grew up as a classical pianist, and then I got into jazz and came over here. But of course, those kinds of musical flavors, so-called microtones, were all around me growing up. And then when I reconnected with my roots later in life here, I always dreamt of being able to play them on my principal instrument, you know. Uh, and so I always thought, why not have, a digital instrument, a digital keyboard that would have some additional keys which you can, program whichever the way you want, because if it's digital, you can just, program whichever tuning you want and you can play it. But I didn't want it to become a kind of a crazy a computer keyboard or like a button keyboard, like the side of an accordion. I don't know, because I'm not that. I want to still be able to play like my heroes, like Herbie Hancock, like McCoy Tyner, like Chick Corea. I still want to be able to fly on the keys. So I said, just five more keys. That's it. Just imagine you have your regular black keys, right? You're just adding, one more layer. That's it. If it's digital, you can do whatever you want. So anyway, I launched this project about 7 years ago. So it started 2 years before the pandemic. But these things are easy to say, very difficult to realize.
Yeah.
I learned anyway. It's very easy to say, I just want to add five keys. I mean, it's still ongoing. I used the first prototype in this album on two tracks. I'm really proud of this achievement. But we're still developing. I recently started, believe it or not, 3D printing these keyboards now, because the original version that I used in the album is a wooden prototype that was built by a harpsichord luthier. I mean, it has digital circuit boards inside, but the actual keys and everything, in order for it to be playable, was built that way. So anyway, there's that, that side that has been developing, and finally I put it, in this album. I realized and played it in this album. But then there are other things, like in some of the pieces, if you will remember that I used my voice, and I kind of, do this thing that I developed over the past couple decades, which is being able to, start improvising in kind of a classical Turkish style, but then I go into scat and then come out of scat and go into that, and I double myself on the piano and so on and so forth. So basically, that too has been coming up and about. It's just that here it is, really kind of fully portrayed, more so than any other album that I've released up until now. So Seven Shades of Melancholia has these different aspects that have been developing over the past, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, and finally it all kind of meshed. And because the Turkishness of the album is obviously central, the melancholic aspect is also central, because melancholia in that part of the world, Greece, Turkey, goes all the way back to ancient Greece. I mean, uh, the ancient Greeks describe it as part of, melancholia, as a black bile. As it has been described like, what, I don't know. I don't want to call out wrong numbers, but I'll say, at least 2,000 years ago,
Yeah.
where I come from. So it's deeply ingrained in the culture. And so it really is the hidden, yeah, it's the kind of secret thread that really kind of holds the album together.
So how did this journey into the music and more specifically jazz begin for you?
Okay. Well, when I was in my early teens, I first connected with progressive rock bands. That was the more likely route where I grew up. But then it didn't take me long to connect with, especially uh, bands like Weather Report and or Chick Corea Electric Band. You know, those were easy to make that connection from, coming out of progressive rock bands. And so it's true that I got into jazz more from, some of the legendary albums, of electric jazz bands, fusion bands, if you will, like, and then I quickly found my way because I got so curious about what really, defines jazz. And then I started reading about it. And one of the books that I purchased at the time mentioned a genius called Charlie Parker. And I was really curious as to what made this guy a genius. Because I grew up again as a classical pianist, I discovered the likes of Mozart, Beethoven, these Chopin much earlier on, and I kind of had an idea of what made those guys geniuses, but what made Charlie Parker a genius? So I remember, I think I was maybe 16, I think, and I went out and I purchased an album by Charlie Parker, and then I put it on, and mind you, again, bebop at that point was a completely unfamiliar musical language to me. So I put it on, and I played it, and I didn't understand a thing. I mean, I really there was no communication between myself and the music, but something deeper inside me told me to roll it again. Like I said to myself, well, if these books say that this guy is a genius, there must be something wrong with me. Let me try it again. And so I played it again, and I didn't get it again, And so I said to myself, I'm going to keep listening. So I remember throughout an entire week, I just played that record over and over again. And then by the end of the week, I remember I was walking down the street and I caught myself whistling one of the tunes. And that's when I knew, wait a second, I'm starting to pick something up. And then, of course, I within about 2 years, I was here at Berkeley. I came here to Boston in 1993. So I've been here for 32 years. And man, that first year, all I listened to was, Bird and Dizzy. I just, I really would up with them. I would go to bed with them. And so, bebop has been ingrained. Now, of course, in Seven Shades of Melancholia, there isn't much bop, but if you're a careful listener, you can hear it in my playing.
Yeah.
Even when I go, deep into Turkish music, it's still there. It
Yeah.
really is.
What was the first live show you saw when you got to America that blew you away? First live jazz show?
Well, I, um, I can't I don't know if it's the first live show, but I do remember going to the Regatta Bar. I don't know if people are familiar with
Yeah.
that club in Boston, but I'm pretty certain that it was 94, early 94. I hope I'm not mistaken, but anyway, it was McCoy Tyner with Michael Brecker. And oh man, I mean, I still remember it. First of all, back then, as you well know, jazz clubs were, they were still getting packed. You know, I'm sorry to say that, that has not been the case for a long time. But back then, we couldn't even find tickets, to multiple shows. You would have to go buy tickets to shows like that, like a couple weeks in advance at least. And so I remember, finding a last minute ticket as a like an 18, 19-year-old Turkish boy, and I remember like standing in the back of the room and oh my God, it was on fire. And so Yes, I was blown away. And, yeah, I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, I'll never forget that night, of course. But on the other, it's also a sad reminder of the very fact that I witnessed in person a kind of a decay, of live jazz. I
Yeah.
mean, when I came to Boston, there were 10 jazz clubs here. Now, two and a half, I guess. And same can be said even about the capital of jazz, New York. I mean, New York lost so many different venues. So, and also, I mean, I'll just say, when I came here again in '93, um, I got to study with some of the big jazz composition heavyweights: Herb Pomeroy, Bob Brookmeyer, George Russell. These guys were still teaching, and so I touched them. I touched the big guys, and so, but then that ended. That era ended, and the clubs started closing down. And so on the one hand, I carried the glory of those days that I got to touch and feel and live. But then within about 5, 6, 7 years, it started taking a different turn. So talk about melancholia.
Yep, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
So, what do you like the best about being a professional musician?
Um, I don't know anything else to do. I mean, yeah, well, okay. I obviously have become an educator. I guess, but still, I couldn't teach nothing but music. Suppose I should add the fact that because of the way my life evolved, there was a kind of a period when I ended up saying I have to study Turkish music. So, because I ended up having to do that while, I was in the United States, um, I ended up having to getting familiar with a discipline called ethnomusicology. That's the only way you can really master any kind of, quote unquote world music tradition while living in the United States. That's the path. And so, because I ended up having to study, that discipline and Turkish music through that discipline, I ended up becoming, a more of an intellectual musician than a lot of other colleagues of mine, but just because I had to read so many different kinds of articles, and that led me into a doctoral path. I hold a doctor of musical arts degree in composition, mind you, but I did a lot of ethnomusicology work. So. So while I do have that side, and I have published a couple of books, while I do have that side, in the end, everything I do, even either as an educator, or ethnomusicologist, or whatever, it's in the end all music. When I get depressed, when I feel that I'm just being sucked deeper into a darker or darkness, for this or that reason, music is the savior again. It's because that state of flow, I can only achieve it through music, whether it's during performance or composition. So I've been drugged, very early on in my life, like many of my other colleagues. So, and that's, by the way, that's how I kind of connected with Sufism too, Islamic mysticism. Just because, they talk about these kinds of states of ecstasy, right?
Mhm.
I didn't know what that was until one day, as a researcher, in fact, I put the two and two together. I was like, man, I've been experiencing that for so long, and so many other musicians and artists, and actually so many in so many different walks of life, we achieve these things. It's just that artists may be able to come to realize that a little quicker sometimes.
Yeah.
So that's how that's why music keeps me going.
So at the end of the day, everyone has a perception of you: family, friends, fans, students, colleagues, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are? Yeah.
Joe, I I'm 50 years old. I turned 50 this year. And like I said, I've been here for 32 years. Um, I used to, I'm kind of a humble person. I don't necessarily, you know, uh, drop things and make big statements. But because I'm 50 years old and I've done what, 20 albums, I think I've released 20 albums, seven only as a under my name, but a lot of them with other bands that I directed and so on and so forth. I mean, so I've done a lot. I've invented a keyboard, I hold the patent for it. I've gotten, the jazz giants like Dave Liebman to commission me to write a piece for him and do an album for him. I've invented another instrument called an electric oud. I've secured the Aaron Copland Grant 3 times, become a Grammy nominee twice. All of this is to say that I think I'm probably the only unique musician in the jazz world that has been able to internalize both the jazz language and the Middle Eastern Turkish makam language. And I think I'm the only one that really speaks or can speak these languages so genuinely, so deeply that I don't fake it. I'm not a tourist in neither world.
Yeah.
And so I can translate them better than anybody out there, and that's my genius.
Wow.
And if the world is not going to catch up to that, it's too bad. I don't want to leave this world without, sharing the goods
Yeah.
because I do have them.
Absolutely.
Um, and some people notice that, some of these reviews that come out, some of them say, wow, because look, there is such a thing as exoticizing culture. I mean, think about how many times jazz has been exoticized, how many times jazz has been reduced to something, that it is so much greater, well, same thing happens with Eastern cultures, and we're never going to be able to stop that. It's part of human nature. But but I took the time. I took the time to internalize jazz, and I took the time to internalize, the music and the culture of my roots. I really did. I invested 10 years at least in each. And so now I'm not a tourist. I don't exoticize. I don't fake it. I don't just, put these things together. Any two musicians from any distant culture can sit down and play something. Don't kid yourselves, right? They can. It's not that hard. One is going to go bing, bang, bang, and the other one's going to do something. And if they're talented enough, they're going to make something out of it. The real refinement is the kind of thing, you know, when someone has really internalized and can really translate between these musical languages from a deeper place.
Yeah.
So yes, I think I'm one of the very few that can do that with Middle Eastern and Turkish specifically, between jazz and Turkish music.
I love it. What a great description. So seven Shades of Melancholia. That's the new album. If anyone wants to catch you live, any of your previous work, any of the good business, where do they go?
Sure. In September, we're actually going to do, just because I'm going on tour now in July, we're going to do actually United States release shows in September. On September, September 8th, 18th. You know what? Hang on. I need to, because one of them is on a Thursday, and that is going to be, yes, September 18th in New York. Drum is the club.
Okay.
We're going to be playing a release show there with Ingrid Jensen, who was featured in the album.
Sure.
And then the next day, we're going to be at the Regatta Bar, where I saw McCoy years ago. and we're going to do a release show in Boston as well. I don't know if I'm going to be able to tag along another show, but at the very least, we're doing two in New York, September 18th and September 19th, Friday, and Regatta Bar in Boston.
I will put those in the show notes, the links. What a great time here. I appreciate your story, wonderful stories. I love the music. Thank you so much for taking a minute out.
Oh, thank you so much for including me and talking to me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.